Good morning, friends, and welcome to the Biblical Perspective. We're at the end of April 2022, so grab a good cup of coffee. I may need to drink a little more of this today. Just while I'm talking, because you can probably tell from my voice, I've been outside in all the spring pollen in South Carolina, and the drainage is just getting to me. So I feel for all of you who are going through the same thing. Just got to remember to take care of ourselves during these times where everything is blooming. But while things are blooming, I want to deal with something unusual in the biblical perspective today. I want to entitle it very much after a message that's almost 22 years old today. I want to call it Wasted Sacrifices. Wasted Sacrifices. I go back to the year 2000 when the annual meeting of the Southern Baptist Convention featured the convention sermon by the late Dr. Bailey Smith. And his message was entitled Wasted Sacrifices, when he talked about how the great cloud of witnesses from Hebrews 11 will look on Southern Baptists. Will they look at what we have done to create this denomination? And will they eventually say, wow, that was a waste? Or will they say, hey, you're sticking with the book and you're making a difference? It's a good question. Back then, as Bailey Smith developed that message, he said some very powerful and some funny things. He began to talk about politics, how it can get involved in the church. And he said, politics is made up of two words, poly, which means many, and ticks, which means blood-sucking insects. So that kind of says it all, doesn't it? Well, it's amazing how much politics has influenced the way the church works these days, what we can and cannot say, will or won't say, and how we seem to be fearful of proclaiming the Word of God in such a way that it has really influenced the preaching of many of our churches to turn us away from the truths of Scripture. Well, I'll get back to that in a little bit, but I love the way that Dr. Smith developed that message back in 2000. In the end, he was saying he thought we as a convention would survive. Why? Listen to this. We are not tied to the times. We are anchored to the book. Well, I wonder from heaven, Dr. Smith, what you're thinking about that statement now. Not tied to the times, but anchored to the book. For many of us, we wonder what happened to our commitment to the Bible, to the book, as we look at some of the headlines that many of you as Southern Baptists don't even get to see. Now, I realize I've got a number of folks around the world that watch me that are not Southern Baptists. You aren't tied to the Southern Baptist Convention, but what you've got to recognize is that for years, this particular group of believers, millions and millions of us, not just around North America, but around the world, have been at the very cutting edge, the point of the spear, so to speak, of the gospel message around the world. Our mission program is one that has made a difference for generations, and yet now we see that threatened in some of the most unusual ways, not from the outside, but from the inside. The Capstone Report's headline that I recently saw said this: Conservative Southern Baptist churches are using your tithes and offerings to enrich radical leftist lawyers. And this is talking about a law firm that the Southern Baptist Executive Committee has hired out of Nashville, Tennessee, that apparently is tied to some very important LGBTQ causes, that sponsored Gay Pride Week, some other things there in Nashville. It's become such a controversy. This particular law firm took all of their charitable giving responses off their website so folks wouldn't be investigating it. It's been quite a mess. The subtitle to that article said, from a Southern Baptist pastor, a quote from a Southern Baptist pastor saying, quote, "The law firm hired by the SBC Executive Committee doesn't whisper about sexual sin, it shouts in support of it." And of course, you recognize that quote going back to Ed Litton's Sermongate. What's going on in our convention? Well, right now we're in the middle of an investigation that's been prompted by our own people who've decided to go out and hire an outside firm called Guidepost Solutions, which if you start investigating the background of this big Madison Avenue, New York multi-territorial company, you'd wonder, why would Southern Baptists put their trust in these people? But yet we have. And to do what? To investigate our own executive committee going all the way back to the year 2000 when Bailey Smith, the late Bailey Smith, delivered that message. For what reason? Apparently, we don't believe that we've handled certain sexual abuse allegations properly. And we also didn't believe we had anybody within a 16 million member convention capable of running that kind of investigation. We had to go get outside people from outside firms who are not proponently Christian organizations to conduct this investigation. Where is it getting us? Well, I call your attention to an article that just recently appeared. I read this part out of the Baptist Courier here in South Carolina, which says the cost of the investigation into alleged mishandling of sexual abuse claims by the Southern Baptist Convention Executive Committee has reached $1.7 million since being commissioned last fall, according to invoice summaries provided to Baptist Press. By the way, that's only through February, and I'm speaking at the end of April. The budget provided by Guidepost Solutions, the firm contracted to conduct the investigation, originally projected it to cost between $1.3 and $1.6 million. Oh, we have cost overruns. I know you're surprised to hear that. Guidepost sends invoices to the Sexual Abuse Task Force commissioned by Southern Baptist Messengers to the 2021 SBC annual meeting. That documentation is then passed to the Executive Committee. From October through February, those invoices totaled $1.743 million. Now, Willie McLaurin, the interim EC president and CEO, said those expenditures reflect the wishes of Southern Baptist regarding the investigation. Really? Do you think that this is what Southern Baptist wanted when messengers were told we have to clear the air and get to the truth of what's been going on in our EC for the last 20 years? Do you think that they really expected you were going to suck this kind of expenditure out of cooperative program funds? Well, hey, we'll get to that in a minute. He says the final authority and final accountability for how funds are spent is given by the messengers and the convention, he said. And Southern Baptists can be confident that while the investigation focused on the executive committee, the EC has diligently fulfilled the request of the messengers by funding the investigation. I'm incredibly thankful for such a time as this. Reserve funds were available to use without having impact on our cooperative work. Really? All right, hang on. Let's get some clarification on that last statement. He said the reserve funds McLaurin referred to are generated from gifts allocated through the cooperative program to the EC. Those reserves have been built over the years through investments and as of February stood at $15 million with $12.2 million in unrestricted funds. Baptist Press has learned that an update on the status of the reserved funds will be given at next week's called EC meeting. Well, did you know we were sitting on that kind of a war chest in reserve funds just at the executive committee of our Southern Baptist Convention? And has there not been, reserve funds tend to be the things that you hang on to for an emergency. My church has a reserve fund. It's teeny tiny compared to this. I mean, it's microscopic compared to this. Most churches, most organizations have some kind of reserve fund. It's great financial management. And you use those in times of emergency. Well, what strikes me is that it wasn't an emergency back in 2015 when we were told by David Platt, the new director at International Mission Board, who had already told the board that hired him that he wouldn't be going around to the churches to promote our missionary endeavors because he wanted to worship with his family on Sundays. So immediately warning bells were going off in many of our minds that we've hired someone who really doesn't have our best interests in mind. He immediately began to say we needed to cut our mission force. In the beginning by at least 600 missionaries, and it became 600 to 800, and some say as many as 1,000, as we began to take what had been a missionary force that eclipsed 5,600 missionaries in 2009 and began to whittle it down. We lost about 15% of our missionaries. We had many of those forced into early retirement. Others just not placed on the mission field because we didn't have enough money. Well, isn't that what we were giving to the cooperative program for? Oh no, you were giving to the cooperative program to set up and see grow a gigantic reserve fund that would eventually be used to investigate your own executive committee. I'm sorry if I'm sounding a little cynical here, but you've got to think about how the average Southern Baptist in the average small church that makes up the backbone of our convention must be looking at this, if they're looking at all. Back in those days, we were told that we had to cut back. Things were looking bleak, and we had to let people go. We had to sell off property, never realizing just how many places we have funds tucked away for emergencies, for reserves in all kinds of different organizations within our convention. Well, if that threat to our Great Commission mandate wasn't enough to spend some of those funds, what in the world is going on now that we are willing to just throw this money at a non-Christian organization left and right? But we're busy covering it up and making it sound like this is all okay. In their September 2021 meeting, the article goes on to say, Executive Committee trustees originally voted to allocate up to $1.6 million for the investigation. Now, at their February gathering, members approved a recommendation that increased the figure to $2 million. Legal fees were originally approved for $500,000, but also increased in February to $2 million in a unanimous vote. Now, keep in mind, these legal fees are now going to an entirely different group than the one that represented Southern Baptists since 1966. A group that bailed on us because we demanded, at least the executive committee demanded after tight, close votes in which many executive committee members resigned over this whole idea, that people be subjected to the loss of attorney-client privilege in this investigation. Something that you or I would never agree to if someone was looking into me. Well, as this thing goes on, we've got a quote here from Bruce Frank. Bruce, I know you. You're now at the head of this investigation. You're supposed to be watching out for Southern Baptists' best interests. Listen to the quote. Bruce Frank, pastor of Biltmore Church in Arden, North Carolina, and chair of the Sexual Abuse Task Force, commended Guideposts' work and thanked them for a $458,154 credit to the February invoice. Bruce, you know how these firms work, right? You bill people way above what you should be charging, then say, hey, guys, we love you. We're going to give you a credit. We're going to bump this back down, but yet we're still way over the budget we originally presented to you. But you see, according to Bruce and this team, that's our fault. He said, I'm very grateful for the immense professionalism shown by Guidepost in dealing with a condensed time frame due to EC delays and a large project. Folks, they knew this was a condensed time frame and a large project when they gave us the initial bid. Now, hang on. He goes on to say, quote, we are also grateful for the professional courtesy discount given by Guideposts due to this project's importance. Now, let me ask you a question. Looking at the size of these bills, if you are in the average Southern Baptist church, how do you feel about it? Are you excited about the way we're spending this money, and what do you think we're going to get for it? Archie Mason, pastor of Central Baptist Church in Jonesboro, Arkansas, and chair of the EC's Committee on Convention Finances and Stewardship Development, pointed out to fellow trustees in February that while the Guidepost report will be released prior to the 2022 SBC annual meeting in Anaheim, bills connected to it and legal fees will continue to be collected throughout the summer. And this is something I pointed out when this news broke last fall. And folks were saying, oh, no, it's all going to be over by Anaheim. No, my friends, it's just going to begin by Anaheim. Unless Guidepost just brings back a report that says, look, nothing to see here. It's all about the autonomy of the local church. People did what they were supposed to. The bases were covered, and maybe some feelings were hurt because some things weren't addressed properly, but there was no impropriety here. There's no criminality here, and let's just get over it and go back to business as usual in the Baptist church. Now, if that's the result of the report, then everybody would be looking at these folks saying, really? And it cost us how much to discover there's nothing to see here? Oh, friends, I think there's a great motivation to bring something to see to the convention. And that the convention is in Anaheim, California this year is even more disturbing because the average Southern Baptist church in the southeastern United States especially, or even in the Bible Belt all the way to Texas, is really hard-pressed in these times to think they're going to send messengers all the way to California for this particular convention. I don't know that we're going to have any record-breaking attendance. Some of you don't want to set foot in California for anything. So it's going to be hard to realize just how we can make our own convention accountable when we can't get messengers to a convention. Folks, this won't be setting any records like we did in Dallas back in the 80s. No, that's not going to happen. So how do we even deal with what's coming up? Listen as this article goes on. I don't know about you, Mason says. We want this all to be done the right way. This is what he said at the February meeting. Reach the right conclusion. Deal with what we're going to deal with. Turn over the rocks. Let's get it right. Well, what are we trying to get right? And how will Southern Baptists respond to this? What actions are going to be recommended that are going to cost more money on the flip side of this? SBC President Ed Litton appointed the task force to oversee an independent third-party review per the motion brought forward and approved by messengers. He said, look, when Southern Baptists voted overwhelmingly in Nashville to authorize this investigation, their will was unmistakable. Our convention sent one loud and clear message. Sexual abuse is something we cannot afford to get wrong. Most all of us would say amen to that. How can you say anything against the idea that we want to make sure that sexual abuse does not happen in our convention, in our churches, or isn't swept under the rug? Well, one of the big issues here is how do you deal with that when we as Southern Baptists are prided by one of our chief components, the autonomy of the local church, which means our convention does not control its churches. It can say by looking at your doctrinal stand and the way that you do some things that you're no longer welcome in the convention. They can kick you out and say, no, you're not in good fellowship with us. But for the most part, you see, Southern Baptists are not a hierarchical denomination. They don't control their churches. Every single Southern Baptist church is literally an independent Baptist church. Think about that. Well, having said that, that's one of our strengths, but apparently for some of the folks who want some kind of across-the-board answer for Southern Baptists, it's one of our weaknesses. How will the reports that are coming out from this investigation, how will those reports be handled? And whose job is it going to be to now make some kind of response? What will that cost you and I? Keep in mind, we stand before our people in pulpits every week and say, isn't it great to be a Southern Baptist? We reach into 181 nations around the world because of our cooperative mission efforts. We're there, whether it's from disaster relief, our missionaries sharing the gospel, and all the things we do around the world by holding hands together in our mission endeavors. That's why our people give to the cooperative program and to those other offerings like the Lottie Moon Christmas offering for international missions. Is this the way they thought their money would be spent? Well, listen to how this article goes on to speak about this as, again, Litton says, quote, this process has been difficult and costly, but these obstacles do not compare to the devastation and pain wrought by sexual abuse. I'm grateful that in recent months, our executive committee staff and trustees have acted decisively to support this investigation. They didn't act so decisively, my friends. They really struggled through this over and over to the point that, again, Directors, many members walked away in disgust, resigned over the way it was being handled. This was not an overwhelmingly supported move. Most of our churches don't even know that. And for those of you who are in the high Baptist circles, I'm friends with so many of you that are in denominational work, whether it's in the Carolinas, in Georgia, around the country. We aren't talking about this. We don't want to bring it up. And for most, it's like a couple of folks I was talking to this week. We want to wait and see how this report is going to come back. Well, the fact that we already are troubled by who's representing us and by this particular group that was hired from outside the convention to come in and do this work is already troubling to many Southern Baptists. What is the result of this going to be? So, are the revelations going to make a difference? Well, the question here as we look at this big move, this big report that's going to come out before June, and I'm saying this because we're about to head into May 2020, getting ready for this convention. Folks, get ready for the roller coaster ride. How much, here's my question for you, average Southern Baptist, how much of your cooperative program dollars are you willing to funnel to this company, and for what? After Anaheim, what will happen? Will we be asked to change Southern Baptist polity? Will we come upon evidence that's going to now put us in the unusual position of having to present some of our volunteers for prosecution? Is there going to be something illegal that's uncovered? Are we going to clear the air and then ask, well, did we need this at all? Folks, the average church looks at this by saying, hey, we as a Southern Baptist church give our mission money for one purpose, the gospel. And that gospel we want to see spread around the world. These new revelations reveal that not all of our mission money has been used for that. And while we were screaming just a few years ago about how short we were on funds and how, oh, woe is me, the sky's falling and we're going to have to bring missionaries home, it seems like we've been tucking away money to use for just such a rainy day as this to instead fund lawyers outside of our convention, big corporations outside of our convention, to make sure that we're presenting the right kind of woke picture to the world. Now, friends, I don't know about you, but that's the feeling a lot of Southern Baptist churches have today. Now, am I suggesting that you jump out of the Southern Baptist Convention, lock the door, run away? No, that's not what I'm suggesting. But if you're within it, friends, this is your denomination. It is your convention. If you and I do not take responsibility for asking the hard questions and keeping our leaders accountable, then we can't complain about the results. Friends, it's an important watershed year coming up for Southern Baptists. Where will it lead us? Stay tuned, my friends, because the next couple of months are going to be so critical. And I want to close with something that's a little bit scary. I'm afraid that we've lost our punch. I'm afraid, like Bailey Smith said, many of our folks from previous generations are looking down to ours and saying, wow, what wasted sacrifices that we've set all these things up to be the great Bible sharing and preaching denomination in evangelical Christianity, and yet now we seem to be losing our way. This happened recently when the head of our own Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission, the acting president, Brent Leatherwood, seemed to comment on the appointment of Ketanji Brown Jackson as a Supreme Court judge by just saying some nice, unoffensive comments. Despite the philosophical and legal differences individuals like me will have with her, Judge Jackson's confirmation is a history-making moment. We should appreciate it as such, end quote. Yeah, where is our prophetic voice? How is it that you cannot say what needs to be said at a time like this? One last quote for you from Tom Askell, who is senior pastor of Grace Baptist Church in Cape Coral, Florida. He posted a screenshot of the ERLC tweet and enumerated the anti-life stance that Jackson holds. Askell is the Southern Baptist Convention presidential candidate for this upcoming June, and he stressed that the ERLC should not have made such remarks. He stressed that we're funding the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission, and yet it seems like we welcomed the appointment of Jackson, who advocates abortion, is backed by the pro-choice movement, is lenient on child sex abusers. Matter of fact, I would add, was one of the most well-funded, far-left, anti-Christian candidates, the most ever presented before the Senate of the United States to become a Supreme Court judge. And we don't say a thing about that. Askell emphasized that Southern Baptists shouldn't be appreciating Jackson's appointment, but instead be weeping because of it. Folks, a generation ago, Southern Baptists would stand up, and even if an issue was unpopular, they would say what was right and true and biblical. Today, so many of our organizations, our conventions, even our news agencies, you are silent about these things, just trying to smooth the waters and make sure nobody's offended. Nobody might be canceling you as a Southern Baptist organization or saying anything bad about you. Friends, where are the prophets of God at a time like this? Well, folks, you're going to have your chance. And here over the next 2 or 3 months, I think, depending on what happens in Anaheim and what our convention actually does, you're going to have a chance to stand up, speak out, speak up, and stand on the Word of God. Or you can just sit down, go to sleep, and let somebody else have control of it all. The choice is yours, my friends. God bless you. I'll see you again next week, each and every day, as we wake up in the Word, and next Saturday for our biblical perspective.